We're at the last section for this chapter. Will we finally go beyond talking about stories and the archetypal lessons contained therein to get to the actionable life advice? This is Peterson. What do you think? This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to This Cognitive Psychologist, finally wrapping up Rule 2 from Jordan B. Peterson's Beyond Order 12 Rules for Life. And that rule is imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Because it's been a hot minute since we started this chapter, let's review. As per the snippet in the overture, we are supposed to be learning how to have an integrated human personality by way of stories and the alchemical image of the chapter art. There was a standard for Peterson: you don't and can't really know or understand yourself. Answers for the question of who you could be can be found through traditional stories, with a nod to the collective unconscious as supporting the importance of these stories. For completeness, there was a bit about a thoroughly abandoned view of memory, followed by Peterson going through a list of forms learning could take, which I took some issue with. All of that can be encoded into story form, which can then, somehow, determine who we are and who we could become. Stories are impactful and important, or in his phrasing, unforgettable, when they represent observed regularities. He laid out some pretty lofty, vague goals for who we could be. That again supports my assertion that he's not actually wanting a balance between order and chaos, but wanting order to be above chaos in the existential dominance hierarchy. He claimed that all of this is hard for us to consciously understand, but wouldn't you know it, we can get that info in anyways, thanks to stories. The third section of this chapter is the first of what is essentially the subchapter, Who You Could Be, and focuses on the meanings embedded in the chapter art. He argued that this image can convey a lot of meaning without the viewer needing to have the context to understand it. I argued against this position. Skipping 9 quotes I showed for this chapter and cutting to the point here, the meaning he said is contained in this illustration is a representation of a fully developed personality, as developed through confronting the unknown and unifying the parts of your personality. Somehow. Then there was a section on the Enuma Elish and what it could tell us about who we could be. His claim about our inability to perceive reality without breaking it into personalities popped up again. I personally enjoy mythology and history, so we spent some time going through the myth and its context. I also want to point out the reappearance of his argument about the importance of tradition, because it is such a through line in this work. Oh, and there is also that part about polytheism being a less advanced form of religion than monotheism, which then also somehow reflects psychological advancement. The Enuma Elish answer to who we could be was a little scattered. It could be along the lines of pay attention and don't lie. It could be to harness the chaos through whatever the principle of heroic action and perception is. It could be to endure suffering. All of these, none of these even. The assertion at the end of this section was that if you can see well enough and are sufficiently brave, you can fight off those chaos snakes. The chaos snake fighting was a segue to the section focused mostly on Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, as he sees Harry as a creative conservative overcoming the demonic chaos snake. Snakes are the image of evil, at least in parts of the broader Western cultural tradition, but never fear, Harry is an ideal person to combat all of this evil because he also has a dark side. I was going to joke about Harry Potter emo phase 1, but remembered a certain fanfic exists that does precisely that. There was a bunch of stuff about this being a Christ allegory, but nothing really solid on the advice front. In this video, we are possibly, finally, going to find out how we get that integrated human personality that we were promised in the overture and hinted at throughout this chapter. I'm sure you know by now, dear viewer, that when I say we're possibly going to find something out in this context, you kind of know whether we're going to or not. As per usual, last little part before diving in, the quick visual recap to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, and this means I'm bringing some science to the discussion. Normally it would also be for talking about Peterson's references, but at this point in the chapter, we've exhausted them. All 11 of them? Sadly, this is probably going to be the last video to feature the experimental bookshelf corner. Last night, we were given 3 months to move out by the landlords because they want to cash in on the already fucking stagnant housing market. So with the pending involuntary move to who the fuck knows where coming, there are ways you can support me in this channel. First, subscribe. it's free. Here is also my Patreon and merch. We are currently in the citation needed side of things, but there's also the Chaos Dragon and another one coming as soon as I get the Schreier video finished. Links for everything are in the description. Oh well, no sense in delaying this any longer. Onward toward aiming at our imaginary selves. We start by somewhat retreading ground covered earlier in this chapter, which I omitted from the recap because it was meh the first time around. But Peterson lays out a potential pathway for how stories develop. First step is mimicry of other people's actions, because, quote, it is easier and more direct to represent a behavioral pattern with behavior than with words, end quote, but it's just mindless and automated. Next step is imitation, which distills the behavior patterns rather than the actions themselves. His example here is a girl imitating her mom by acting as if she herself were a mother. This is not just mimicry, because her actions apparently convey a deeper understanding than she can articulate. He goes on to say that you can get an estimate for what mother means in its purest form by abstracting the commonalities of many girls acting like moms. I'm going to pop in here to comment that this pure representation of motherhood is still tied to culture. These kids are play acting what they see. How moms act in our culture can be different from how moms act in other cultures. The more advanced form of imitation is drama, specifically theatrical productions. The next step in difficulty is apparently literature. Except he doesn't mean what I think most people mean by literature. This will become more clear in a little bit, but he's just meaning stories. Literature is more difficult because it has to convey the behavior without a physical space. I may be speaking out of my lane a bit here, but I don't know if I would say theater or other acted out story forms are more or less difficult than literature. There's a skill for being successful in both, separately or together. Just because something was a good book doesn't mean it'll translate well to the screen or stage, and vice versa. The greatest of stories come from a story being refined by generations of great storytellers. Once cultures become literate, something that has happened only recently from a historical perspective, those stories can be written down. It is at this point, roughly, that myth and ritual might be said to transform themselves into religion. Cool. So that First Nations tribe that Peterson is sort of affiliated with through a friend, they don't have a religion because they didn't write anything down. Other groups through history who didn't write anything down don't have religious beliefs. Writing things down is the thing that divides a collection of stories from a religion. That, roughly, isn't buying Peterson the leeway here that he might want it to. More broadly speaking, the gist from this seems to be that important behavioral regularities are conveyed through stories and formalized into religious beliefs. In a chapter on figuring out who we could be, in a book of life advice. Given the rest of his body of work, it's probably reasonable to make the connection that this means we should allow tradition to guide and shape us into who we could be. Now, if you're choosing the traditional life path for yourself, cool. But people shouldn't be forced down that path through any of the mechanisms that are apparently still on the table in 2022. The imitation and communication of the greatest, most memorable acts necessitates the distillation and communication of the patterns of the deepest wisdom of mankind. I promise you that you aren't prepared for where this is going. Well, maybe you are. I certainly wasn't. Especially when the italics hit. If a great and memorable act is one undertaken by a particularly admirable individual, a local hero, then the greatest and most memorable acts possible would be those undertaken by the spirit, embodied in part by particular individuals, who exemplified what all local heroes everywhere have in common. That hero or heroes, that meta-hero, would have to exist, logically, in turn, in a place that was common across all places requiring heroism. Wait, pause. I need a second with this. This is broaching on collective unconscious territory again, but this logically existing meta place for this meta hero to act out all forms of memorable acts? Really? This is so abstract to basically be meaningless, and that's only going to get worse as we continue. He's acting like there are heroic acts, universal across time and space, but that isn't fully the case. What about great and memorable acts that are culture specific? Onwards with the big-brainedness.
That place might be regarded as a meta world, even though it is real, even hyper-real. That is, more real in its abstraction across places than our direct perceptions of a given singular time or place. It is precisely this hyper-real meta-world that consists of the continual interactions between chaos and order, which eternally serve as the battleground between good and evil, characterizing the hero.
Devoid of context, what would you think if somebody started passionately telling you about a hyper-real meta-world that consists of the continual interactions between chaos and order, which eternally serve as the battleground between good and evil, characterizing the hero? And this is a place that is more real than that which you can directly perceive. If couching life advice in this grandiose framing is what's keeping some youths from falling into blackpilling themselves, I imagine some D&D DMs could be rallied to the cause.
The undying pattern that hero embodies, in turn, upon whose actions the individual and society both depend, is the highest of all gods. He is both child of and mediator between those twin forces, transforming chaos into habitable order, as well as recasting order into chaos so that it can be renewed when it has become anachronistic and corrupt, as well as battling mightily so that good might prevail.
Once again, chaos only serving to benefit order, not as a useful thing in its own right in the balance between the two. The thing, exemplified by Peterson's apparent temporary but reinstated willingness to quite possibly literally die on the transphobic hill, is that adhering to tradition can make it near impossible to see when the old way of doing things is anachronistic and corrupt. There is an almost mandatory belief among conservatives that the new way of doing things is going to shake civilization to its core.
If in finding your true identity, you violate a cultural norm that's so profound that you destabilize the entire country, the entire culture, then maybe you don't have the right to do that, even if it actualizes yourself.
Everyone requires a story to structure their perceptions and actions in what would otherwise be the overwhelming chaos of being. Every story requires a starting place that is not good enough and an ending place that is better. Nothing can be judged in the absence of that end place, that higher value. Without it, everything sinks into meaninglessness and boredom, or degenerates and spirals into terror, anxiety, and pain.
I hate this perception thing every time it comes up. Yes, you do need experience in processing the world with the sensory equipment you've got at critical periods of development. Otherwise, it's going to be harder to make sense of things. You also need to be able to have input or control or just an active role in your experiential history to use the sensory input coming in. But what's this about stories? I suspect this is another place where Peterson's playing fast and loose with the meanings of words. Again, this is a writing trick he used a lot in the original 12 Rules, and I kind of doubt it's a writing trick he grew tired of. But trying to be clever using the multiple meanings of words interchangeably does not clear writing make. It's entirely possible he's alluding to the Gibson stuff he cited last time around, but as we've seen, he is far less referencey in this book. Unless it's his works, then he can fill the reference page right up. That Gibson book, begrudgingly bought for me by a lobster and just out of frame, says a lot of things, but it seems a stretch to say that it supports the idea that stories are needed to structure perception. This whole thing seems like a pale imitation of these arguments from 12 Rules. First time around, we had a more detailed justification for this idea. Now it's just, you have to have a higher value to judge things against, which is also the end state of a story, otherwise raisin cookies of doom. What were we talking about again? Oh, right. Stories and how to live your life. Why is ennui or doom the consequence of no valuable ending state? What is the support for any of this? Anyways, time marches on, and the old stories may fail and need to be replaced. Details for why aren't specified, so it's probably safe to assume he's meaning the stuff related to the creative conservatives being the ones to update and keep fresh society and culture. So the actor of that failed story must bow to the spirit of creative transformation that originally created and may need to destroy and recreate that story. It would be interesting to hear how and why stories fail, maybe even with some examples. It would certainly flesh out and support the point he's trying to make. Might also make it more clear how an actor inside that story is supposed to replace or recreate that story. Only thing I've got coming to mind is Bastion from the Neverending Story. And Deadpool, I guess, because he just does whatever.
It is for this reason that creative transformative spirit eternally transcends dogma. Truth transcends presupposition. Marduk transcends the elder gods. Creativity updates society, and Christ transcends the law. As does Harry Potter, along with his courageous but continually rule-breaking friends. But it is important to remember, as we discussed in Rule 1, those who break the rules ethically are those who have mastered them first and disciplined themselves to understand the necessity of those rules and break them in keeping with the spirit rather than the letter of the law.
What? Don't get me wrong, I do appreciate that Peterson tied this back into Rule 1. It's nice when things are more cohesive. But what does any of the transcendent talk even mean? For example, as we talked about a couple videos ago in part 3, Marduk got to be top god in the Babylonian story because he was Babylon's patron god. Other Mesopotamian ruling powers had different gods in that seat. I don't think I would say he transcended the other gods and was some maverick rule breaker in that story. He was a Bronze Age Superman who was able to defeat Tiamat. I'm not sure if he's still doing it, but Peterson used to do yoga with his wife. Good thing. As much as he's reaching with this next part, he could have pulled something.
The second volume of Rowling's series proposes that predatory evil can be overcome by the soul willing to die and be reborn. The complete series ends with a creatively transformed repetition of the same message. The analogy with Christianity is obvious, and the message, in essence, the same. The soul willing to transform, as deeply as necessary, is the most effective enemy of the demonic serpents of ideology and totalitarianism in their personal and social forms.
There is a trope called "everyone is Jesus in purgatory," which I think is fitting here. My voice is dying. The idea is that when you start looking for the deep meanings in stories too hard, you start interpreting, quote, "every plot is an allegory for the rebuilding of one's soul, every setting is a manifestation of purgatory, and every protagonist as a stand-in for the Christ." If the trope fits, how is Harry getting Phoenix Ex Machina'd after the basilisk fight a retelling of the Jesus resurrection story? Are we really so creatively stagnant as a species that everything has to be the collective unconscious trying to implicitly shape us by way of media? I'm pretty sure Harry didn't go into that encounter with the intent to die, and I'm also pretty sure in the Jesus story he knew death was part of the plan. And how did Harry transform in that fight? My memory is he seemed fairly similar to how he was before, just with a dead basilisk now. Lucking your way through encounters doesn't really seem conducive to fostering growth. I suppose he learned about the snake-talking ability by way of Voldus Soul Chunk, but where does that fit in? Jesus' inner Satan? Also, this destructive, deep transformation as the most effective way to defeat ideology and totalitarianism is worrying to me. A similar point from the previous book was to sacrifice that what you love most in order to become who you might become and save the world, in the chapter on pursuing meaning. Why make this destruction or sacrifice of self seem like a necessary step for what should ultimately be positive growth? You shouldn't have to tear yourself down to your barest, rawest parts before you can work on improving yourself. That's inflicting unnecessary pain on people for no reason. Of course, Peterson doesn't see it that way.
The healthy, dynamic, and above all else truthful personality will admit to error. It will voluntarily shed, let die, outdated perceptions, thoughts, and habits as impediments to its further success and growth. This is the soul that will let its old beliefs burn away, often painfully, so that it can live again and move forward, renewed. This is also the soul that will transmit what it has learned during that process of death and rebirth, so that others can be reborn along with it.
It occurs to me part of Peterson's inspiration here may have been his health journey, following what sort of but not really started way back with the apple cider incident. The journey that led him to work on writing this book while recovering from incredibly risky medical treatment in Russia, among other places. I wouldn't be surprised if he sees himself as that soul, trying to transmit its knowledge of death and rebirth from that difficult time. I've had my share of transformative experiences. I mean, fuck, I'm in the middle of one right now, assuming it ever gets anything resembling a conclusion. And these experiences do change you, give you knowledge that you want to pass on to others. But the important piece I think Peterson's missing in all of this demonstrated by his Twitter situation, is that because he is so entrenched in the social conservative beliefs and ideology of his, he cannot or will not see the errors he's racking up. He isn't shedding the outdated perceptions, thoughts, and habits that are impeding what could be his growth. He's tripling or quadrupling down on them because he seems to believe the outdated is correct. The chapter having AIM in the title made me think that we were going to see some AIM discussion from the previous 12 rules, either repurposed or rehashed or just straight lifted. But nope, just going straight into aiming without talking about why we're talking about AIM, like attention and purpose and hierarchies of value and just aim.
Aim at something. Pick the best target you can currently conceptualize. Stumble toward it. Notice your errors and misconceptions along the way. Face them and correct them. Get your story straight. Past, present, future, they all matter. You need to map your path. You need to know where you were, so you can take the past. You need to know voluntarily confront what stands in your way. The way. That is the path of life. The meaningful path of life. The straight and narrow path that constitutes the very border between order and chaos, and the traversing of which brings them into balance.
I'm sure I'm not the only one who's entertained the thoughts that are going to follow here, but I thought it would be interesting to put them into the framework he's given us here. Special content advisory before diving in. We're going to get to why Peterson's no longer on Twitter. As such, we're going to be hitting his tweets regarding trans people, as well as his takes on women's bodies. Time code to skip. Also, for simplicity, we're going to basically ignore the temporary deletion of the page tweet because he got the soft ban reinstated after finishing up whatever housekeeping he needed to do so desperately. Apparently, sometime before the Sports Illustrated tweet, he wanted to take a step back from Twitter. He was having difficulty doing so. But he had his aim. Get off Twitter. Path. Have staff manage the account. Which didn't last long, it seems. His response to the Sports Illustrated cover model happened. Remember, this was after he had started his little experiment of not engaging with Twitter as much. He then, allegedly, handed the Twitter keys over to staff, whoever those people may be. He's back on the straight and narrow path of disengaging from Twitter. Another note, we're going to focus on this account's tweets regarding LGBTQ topics, in particular trans people, because he is a prolific tweeter. So aside from this comment, we're going to ignore the magnitude of tweets on things like vaccine fearmongering, climate change denial, and green fearmongering, inclusivity and diversity fearmongering, on top of general updates or ads for his stuff. Maybe he was initially able to not tweet any and everything, but it seemed like he was quickly back in the driver's seat again. The speed these tweets were happening almost made it feel compulsive. He just had to share his thoughts on all these things. The people must know, they must be informed of his thoughts. The clamoring exoskeletons, clattering lobster antenna, always awaiting the next update on culture war topics. But I want to highlight something in this tweet tsunami. His language has always been deliberate. He had always stayed within Twitter's terms of service until the Elliot Page tweet. This is absolutely speculation on my part, but it seems like all of his attempts to not engage with Twitter kept hitting a critical flaw. He could still tweet, despite whatever blocks his staff put in place. So what is a man who is supposedly selling life advice instructing us to take ownership of our lives, faults and all, supposed to do? He certainly wasn't keeping to the pinned tweet about staff taking over, so self-control plus staff help wasn't enough. I think it is entirely possible Peterson intentionally invoked the TOS soft ban with the transphobic tweet. He had to have known that would be the result, and it would give him a horse to be all high and mighty on, and potentially drum up buzz for his new Daily Wire venture. Pretty sus. But he did accomplish his disengage from Twitter goal with seemingly single-minded determination. I'll give him that. Could have done it without the collateral damage, but, With that tangent out of the way, let's talk about the end of this quote. He's trying to be cute with word meanings again, flipping about with way. Although, surprisingly, he isn't bringing in the Taoist way this time. The interesting thing to me here is him saying the meaningful life path is the straight and narrow one between order and chaos. Adventure and fun and growth can come from wandering off that path. Take little side journeys into chaos, into the things that'll shake things up. You can also take little jaunts into order, like see a classical ballet. Focusing too much on trying to maintain this straight and narrow path, on trying to max out the meaning per life unit, means you're going to miss things. It's also weird that this is what we're supposed to be pulling from all of this talk about stories. In the stories we covered, and the general hero story, Things start out with the protagonist in a somewhat ordered place before chaos swoops in and shakes things up. They have to go out and do a heroism and defeat the chaos before they can return back to their new order. That seems to be much more in line with Peterson's general tendency to being an order city surrounded by chaos forests instead of this straight and narrow path between the two. We are almost done with the Petersoning. You know how these last few paragraphs can be with him, dear viewer. We need to aim at something profound and noble and lofty. But don't be afraid to switch paths as things change, said many different ways. Ooh, time for his promises.
You will then find yourself turning across time, incrementally and gracefully, to aim ever more accurately at that tiny pinpoint.
Yada yada.
In the center of the cross, to aim at the highest value of which you can conceive. You will pursue a target that is both moving and receding. Moving, because you do not have the wisdom to aim in the proper direction when you first take aim. Receding, because no matter how close you come to perfecting what you are currently practicing, new vistas of possible perfection will open up in front of you. Discipline and transformation will nonetheless lead you inexorably forward.
This advice makes me mad enough it gets to jump the queue. Telling people to seek perfection is horrible advice. It's only setting them up for failure. To clarify, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to do our best when we're doing something, but for pretty much everybody, that isn't going to be perfect, and that's okay. Perfect is the enemy of good. Demanding perfection is potentially robbing us of works that, despite their imperfections, could bring us joy or progress or comfort. This demand for perfection is adding stress to what may already be stressful endeavors. Why do this to your readers, Peterson? Buried and obfuscated in here is some advice I don't mind. To paraphrase, when you're trying to accomplish something, don't stress about your first steps towards that goal. Any sort of attempts, even if it doesn't really get you anywhere, is still teaching you something. Over time, you'll be better able to accomplish that thing. Those early fumbles are part of learning. But somewhat counter to the last part of this quote, I wouldn't necessarily say that all progress is forward. Sometimes backward steps happen, and it sucks when it does, I know. But the important part is you keep trying.
With will and luck, you will find a story that is meaningful and productive, improves itself with time, and perhaps even provides you with more than a few moments of satisfaction and joy. With will and luck, you will be the hero of that story, the disciplined sojourner, the creative transformer, and the benefactor of your family and broader society. Imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that.
Wait a minute, luck? How do we boost our luck stats, Peterson? Don't get me wrong, I am incredibly glad he's even acknowledging the role of luck here, but this is the first time it's really coming up. At the end of this chapter. Harry Potter lucked out all the time, but I could see Peterson downplaying that since Harry's supposed to be a competent, creative conservative in charge of his own destiny and saving the wizarding world. Peterson himself, or any fairly successful person, has experienced their own shares of luck. With regard to myself and this channel, I can basically point to every sizable jump I've had in subscriber count coming from a different YouTuber, larger channel than mine, stumbling across my videos and giving me a boost. That's the majority of growth I've seen on this channel. Algorithm schmalgorithm. There's the parts you have control over and can do things to improve on in whatever thing you're trying to accomplish, and you absolutely should be trying to do those things, but luck? It's such a fickle thing. How do you plan for luck? Well, that was impressive and underwhelming, all at the same time. No easy feat. We were told that stories indicate who you could be a couple different ways, had this sort of expanded on but not really explained through alchemy in Harry Potter, were somewhat told to pay attention because of the Enuma Elish, eventually found out we need to metaphorically die and be reborn in the name of good and order, and also to learn and grow, and rounded it out with a sort of do better because of stories and myths. This almost feels like the written life advice version of the scene in Red Dragon where Ralph Fiennes' character has Philip Seymour Hoffman's character strapped to a chair and is flashing pictures at him asking, "Do you see? Stories tell us who we could be. Do you see?
Yes.
You must fight against the chaos. Do you see?
Yes.
Alchemy tells us how to unify our personality. Do you see?
Oh my God.
point after point after point, but it ultimately feels so disconnected from the core promise of this chapter. Going back to the Overture's description of this rule, we did analyze that alchemical image, but the how of developing an integrated human personality didn't seem to happen. It doesn't help that what an integrated human personality even would be wasn't explicitly said. He talked around it, but never got closer than broad, Jung-flavored vagueness. In the rules we've previously gone through, he can meander off the topic described by the rule name, but generally you can see the topic off in the distance, at the horizon at the very least. Not always, but usually. This one introduced an interesting variant. We were technically very deep in the weeds of imagining who we could be. So deep that I'd argue we lost the thread of how to actually apply any of the things we were talking about in the majority of this chapter. The case could absolutely be made that he's trying to mentor by way of providing an example of how to pull meaning out of a creative work and apply that to one's life that the readers could then try to emulate. But if that's what's going on, he failed on a couple fronts. For one, in my experience at least, if you're expecting somebody to learn by shadowing you, you have to let them know that. Otherwise, they may just be passively following along, thinking that some sort of explanation or teaching of the thing will happen later, and then it doesn't. When this happens, it's not the learner's fault that they weren't ready. Second, the connection to actionable advice is murky at best. Being a champion in the name of order and aiming at the highest good, but what does that actually mean? One person's order is another person's terrorism in Minecraft, so would be helpful to clarify a bit. Related to that is a problem that seems to be recurring in this book. How does someone know when their thoughts and beliefs are outdated? How do they know when they are stagnating culture rather than renewing it? I understand that these can be deep, hard philosophical questions to wrestle with, but setting up this chapter, this book, as how to live your best life with some of these concepts woven into the fabric, but not trying to address these philosophical questions? Is it because he's taking them as read, that people will be able to figure out that part on their own? It's everything on top of it they need help with? Or is it because he doesn't have answers to these questions himself? Or does he, but he's just unwilling to explicate it in the text for whatever reason? Questions. But we have the power to not leave it open-ended. We can try and pull useful things from the starting point Peterson's given us. Fictional works and other stories can be an invitation for introspection. Maybe a character really resonates with you. Maybe a story reminds you of something you're going through. You may have awareness of why it's striking a chord with you, such as my growing resonance with V from Cyberpunk, seeing as how my brain seems to be just glitching out more and more as I go on. But you might also not know why it's grabbing you, and that is where things get interesting. If a character or story is really grabbing your attention and occupying your thoughts, it may be a good exercise to have a think on it. An unhappy example comes from some people finding extreme discomfort with the main character's relationship in the 50 Shades series. Now, it was uncomfortable for a lot of people because it was a toxic and cringe relationship, but for some people, what they were seeing on screen was hitting uncomfortably close to home for the relationships they were in. They were seeing parts of very familiar behavior patterns writ large and getting to view what it looked like from the outside, seeing how inexcusable the abuser's behaviors were. Having a mirror held up to something like that can be a very powerful experience, and one that shouldn't be ignored or dismissed. If something like that happens to you, talk to a trusted friend. Open up a little about what you saw and felt. I can say how absolutely shocked and heartbroken I was when I got a more complete picture of my friend's former relationship. There was so much going on that I just didn't know about, and had I known, things would have gone different, I can tell you that. Hearing someone else react with disbelief, shock, or horror at some things that you may have just come to accept as normal or think this is just how things are is important. Abuse and manipulation are never okay. But you can come to accept a lot when you're trying to just survive with somebody that you love. Happier examples come by way of asking my Discord. Basically, it's not an uncommon part of the trans and or non-binary experience to have a really strong connection to a character or really resonate with a story that ends up having some trans coding or themes built into it before you're really at a place where you're able to identify yourself as trans and or non-binary. Some of the sources of these feels and vibes shared by my Discord peeps were some anime IPs, sci-fi or cyberpunk-ish works, video games, musical artists, and finally, the thing that launched a bit of discussion, porn. Giving yourself a moment to think about why something speaks to you can give you insight into stuff going on behind the scenes upstairs. In this process, though, it is important to keep in mind that creative works aren't necessarily free of ideology or propaganda. Sometimes this arguably can be a good thing, like trying to normalize the mere existence of marginalized groups. It may be driven by capitalist forces, but if that's what it takes to get more people used to the idea of LGBTQ people and or people of color and or other marginalized groups just vibing along with everyone, so be it. It can also reinforce or encourage certain modes of being. This is part of the discourse around representation mattering. Seeing how different people live lets us see what sorts of things are possible. If we're only getting to see people go through the cisgender, heterosexual, nuclear family life, it can be more difficult to find your best life outside of that box. And of course, I'm not saying that the more inclusive media says that you can't be happiest with your assigned gender, be attracted to the opposite sex, and want a family. No, you do you. As long as everyone's consenting, have at. Getting to something from the back half of this chapter, it is important to cultivate your ability to confront the difficult things in your life. I am not saying that you always have to have the emotional capacity to do the confronting, or that you have to strip yourself down to your most raw, vulnerable components to do so. But you need to be able to meet life in its bullshit and say, no, this isn't going to work, this isn't what I need, this isn't going to happen. Grab life by its stupid horns, put its nose in the mess, and say, you're going to help me clean this up. Set and maintain your boundaries. If people or situations don't honor those boundaries, work to get into a situation where they do. This is much, much easier said than done, I know. Take what small steps you can and just keep building. If you find yourself in a bad situation, realizing it's a bad situation is step one. After that, work on removing yourself from that situation. Maybe it's saving up money to strike out on your own. Maybe it's changing your friend group or your job. You don't have to stay stuck. The last point to counter from Peterson's advice in this chapter is to reiterate something from the last video. You do not have a moral imperative to be 100% truthful with everyone all of the time. Generally, you should probably try to be as honest as the situation will allow, but for the love of Chaos Dragons everywhere, not if it puts your safety at risk. Why Peterson can't see this potential problem, I will never understand. So yeah, maybe a little less imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that, and a little more find inspiration on how to live your best life where you can, and welcome opportunities for growth. Now, what does Peterson have in store for us next? Ooh. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Place your bets now if it's going to be as cool as the name suggests it will be. Until next time, bye.